They're still in there. All of them. Every last one. Don't you look too long at the big one by the window. It ain't showing you yourself anymore. Hasn't been for I don't know how long now. Just keep your eyes low and follow what the ledger says. He wrote it all down. The old man wrote it all down. There is a particular kind of fog that lives only in the high hollows of the Blue Ridge. Not the thin morning mist that burns off by 9 o'clock. No. This is the heavy fog. The wet kind. The kind that presses itself against your skin like a second garment you did not choose to put on. The kind that has weight to it. Real substance. As though the mountain itself has exhaled and simply decided not to breathe back in. It was that fog that filled Reflection Ridge the evening I drove up the gravel trace to Aldous Vaughn's workshop. The estate company had sent me. That is all you need to know about my reason for being there. Aldous Vaughn had died, quietly, they said, in his chair by the work table, the way that very old men sometimes cease. No drama to it, no family to speak of. A neighbor 2 hollows over had found him after a week of no smoke rising from the chimney, and the county had turned the matter over to the estate office, and the estate office had turned the matter over to me. My name is not important. What I saw inside that workshop, that is what matters. That is what I need to lay down now, slow and careful, the way you lay down a sleeping child, so that every detail rests in exactly the right place and nothing is jostled loose. The workshop sat at the end of a rutted lane, hidden behind a stand of old-growth hemlocks that had somehow survived the blight that had taken their kin from the lower elevations. They rose up on either side of that lane like the fingers of 2 enormous hands pressed together in something that was almost prayer. The fog moved through them in long, slow ribbons, and in the headlights of my truck, those ribbons looked almost solid, almost purposeful, as if they were drifting toward the workshop rather than simply through it. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Rain on a tin roof is one of the oldest sounds a person can hear, and it has layers to it. The sharp, bright percussion of individual drops, and underneath that, a lower, continuous wash, like the sound of a creek bed running fast after a long, soaking rain. The workshop had a tin roof, and the rain was working on it steadily. And I sat in my truck and listened to that sound and told myself, quite sensibly, that there was nothing unusual about any of this. The front door was unlocked. The estate company had been given a key by the county office, but the lock turned out not to matter. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently. Within the last few months, I would have guessed. And the smell that came out to meet me was not the smell of a dead man's house, which I had prepared myself for. It was something older and stranger than that. Mercury, sulfur, and beneath those two, something I could not name with any certainty. A mineral smell, cold and faintly sweet, like a creek stone split open after a long winter to reveal what had been quietly growing in the dark inside it. I stepped inside. The workshop was long and narrow, running back from the door the way a hallway sometimes simply decides to become a room without announcing the transition. And on every wall, on shelves that ran floor to ceiling, on the work table that occupied the center of the space, on freestanding frames arranged in rows like a silent congregation waiting for a service that was long overdue, mirrors. Dozens of them, scores of them. Not the bright, clean mirrors of a department store or a hotel lobby. These were old mirrors. Old in the way that ridge country itself is old, carrying a darkness inside the glass that was not quite reflection and not quite shadow, but something that lived in the narrow space between those two things. The silvering on many of them had gone cloudy at the edges, retreating slowly toward the center of each pane, the way river ice retreats in the first true thaw of March, pulling back from the warmth in long, uneven fingers. In the light of my electric torch, the surfaces shifted in colors I did not entirely have words for. Pewter and smoke, and the gray-green of a deep mountain creek running cold in November. I moved slowly down the center of the room, and this is where I need you to hold something carefully in your mind. The mirrors lagged. Not all of them, and not all at once. But as I walked that narrow corridor between the shelves and the standing frames, I would catch, in the corner of my vision, in the peripheral place where the mind is most honest, the movement in a mirror that came a half-second, perhaps a full second, behind where I actually stood, as though the glass had to think about what it was receiving, as though my image was traveling to it from somewhere slightly further away than the distance between my body and its surface. I told myself it was the warping of old glass. I told myself it was the quality of the torchlight, its movement creating tricks of tired perception. I told myself a number of sensible things, and I kept moving, and the rain kept working on the tin roof above me, and the fog pressed itself against the workshop's 4 small windows with what I can only describe even now as patience. The work table at the center of the room held Aldous Varne's tools, arranged with a kind of deliberate care that speaks of long habit. Silver nitrate solution in dark brown glass bottles, each one labeled in that careful, old-school hand. Soft cloths folded into precise squares. A hydrometer. A thermometer in a wooden case. A mixing bowl in which the ghost of the last batch of silvering agent had dried into a thin, iridescent film along the bottom, catching my torchlight and throwing it back as something faintly violet. And beside the bowl, a ledger. Not the neat spiral-bound kind, a hand-stitched ledger. The cover made from leather that had been stained to near black by decades of handling, worn smooth along the spine and the corners in the way that only a thing reached for constantly. A thing consulted the way some people consult scripture, ever grows smooth. I set my torch on the table, angled it so the beam fell across the open pages, and I leaned down to read. The handwriting in the first section of the ledger was small and deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had been taught that a letter carelessly formed was a form of small dishonesty. There were receipts there, dates going back 40 years or more, names of customers from towns and hollows and gap communities I recognized from my work with the estate office. Ordinary commerce. The records of a craftsman who had built a modest, quiet life from a modest, quiet trade. But somewhere near the middle of the ledger, the handwriting changed. It did not become less careful. If anything, it became more so, as though the writer understood that what he was setting down in this section required a precision that bookkeeping never had, that a mistaken word here carried consequences that a mistaken measurement in a silvering solution never could. The heading at the top of that page read, in letters pressed so firmly into the paper that they were nearly embossed from the reverse side, True Reflect Protocol for the keeping of windows. Do not deviate. I will tell it to you the way the old man wrote it, in the same slow, considered rhythm he used, because I believe he chose that rhythm the way a careful doctor chooses the exact words they will use to deliver serious news to a patient who is not yet ready to hear it. The mirrors, he wrote, were not mirrors. That is to say, the glass was real. The frames were real. The silvering agent was real, made in the old manner, with mercury and nitric acid and tin chloride, the same as any good-looking glass had ever been prepared. But the purpose of the finished object was not reflection. The purpose was containment. He wrote about the fog of Reflection Ridge, the particular fog, the high, hollow fog, the wet fog with weight to it. He wrote that his grandfather had first noticed, long before Aldous himself was born, that certain things moved through that fog. Not animals, not people. Things that had the approximate shape of a person, the way a shadow cast by an odd-shaped skep or a lightning-blasted stump has the approximate shape of a crouching figure. Close enough to reach some old, unguarded part of the mind, not close enough to be mistaken for the real article by anyone who looked directly. His grandfather had called them the mist-kin. The older folk of the ridge country, going back further than any living memory, had other names for them. Gap shadows, hollow shapes, names that described what they were without pretending to explain it. The word that appeared most often in Aldous' ledger, the word he had settled on after what appeared to be years of careful consideration, was simply the others. The others were drawn to glass, to any reflective surface. They pressed against it from outside, from whatever outside they occupied, which was not the outside a person walked through when they opened a door onto an ordinary mountain morning, and they looked in. And if the glass was not properly prepared, if the silvering had thinned or worn or been applied without sufficient intention, they could, given enough time and enough patience, begin to press through. The silvering agent was not merely for reflection. It was a seal, a barrier. Applied correctly, in the old sequence, with the correct ratios and the correct unhurried intention, the silver layer on the backing of the glass created something the others could not pass, something they could lean against and press against, and apply the whole of their considerable, cold patience to, and it would hold. Every mirror Aldous Varn had ever sold to a customer in the hollows and the gaps and the small ridge country towns had been made this way, each one a properly sealed surface, each one placed in a home or a business or a schoolroom so that the others, who were everywhere, always, once you knew to look for the lag in the reflection, once you had learned to watch for that half-second of delay, could press themselves against the glass all they wished, and be held there. He had not been making mirrors. He had been making windows. And every window he made was a small, sealed jail cell, tended quietly, without any ceremony, without any recognition, for more than 40 years. He had been a jailer. A very long pause, filled only by rain on tin. And the mirrors in this workshop, the unsold ones, the ones that had never found homes, the ones that had been here the longest. These were the holding cells that had grown the most crowded. The ledger did not, in that section, attempt to quantify what each pane contained. It used instead a word I had to read 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. Congregation. I became aware of the pressing before I looked up from the ledger. That is the only way I know to describe it. pressing, a sense of accumulated, patient weight gathering in the room around me. The way you feel a space filling with people behind you even before you turn to see them. It came on slowly, and it was unmistakable. I raised my eyes from the page. Every mirror in the workshop had shifted. Not in position. The frames had not moved an inch, but in the quality of what was held within the glass. The lag I had noticed on first entering had deepened into something else entirely. What I saw in the mirrors now was no longer any version of the room I was standing in, no longer any version of me. In every pane, pressing close against the glass from the far side, were shapes. Not monstrous shapes, not the hard-edged, sharp-clawed things of the nightmares a person carries up from childhood. These were soft shapes, the shapes of presences that had been standing inside mountain fog for so long that the fog had begun to fill them up, to round whatever edges they once possessed, to soften anything that had ever been specific or particular about them. They pressed their palms flat against the glass from the inside, and I could see the impressions clearly. The way you see a handprint left on a cold window by someone who has already walked away. And they leaned toward me with a patience so old and so absolute that it was more unsettling than any urgency, any hunger, any sharp and obvious threat could ever have been. The ledger had a final section, written in darker ink, applied more recently, within the last year, perhaps the last few months, as though Aldous had known toward the end that someone would need to read this. For whoever comes after me, if you are reading this, it means I did not finish the final round of resilvering before I went. The agent is already mixed and waiting on the table. The sequence is written below. You must coat each pane before the sun is fully down. When the fog reaches its full depth at true dark, the seal on older glass grows thin, and what is held inside grows restless. Work slowly. Rushing wastes the agent and breaks the intention the work requires. Speak a name aloud for each window as you coat it. Any name you choose, a name you know or a name you invent, so that the glass understands it is being kept and cared for and held. Do not make direct eye contact with what is pressing from the other side, not because they mean you harm, but because if they believe you can see them clearly, they will press harder. And old glass has limits that younger glass does not. Start now. There is still time if you start now. And so I did. I lifted the mixing bowl from the table. The silvering agent Aldous had prepared, silver nitrate and reducer in the proportions his grandfather had passed down, moved in the bowl like something alive, like liquid smoke captured and contained, folding and turning on itself in slow, continuous motion. The same gray-violet as the inside of a storm cloud seen from far below. I took up the soft cloth. I began at the furthest mirror, the smallest one, set into the back corner of the workshop where the shadows gathered deepest. I drew the cloth across its surface in slow, long strokes, the way you stroke a restless animal until it stills. And I named it. I called it patience, the way you name a thing you want to keep. I worked my way forward, pane by pane, frame by frame, and the shapes on the other side of each glass subsided as I coated it, not disappearing, not fleeing, but simply growing still, growing calm, settling back into whatever depth they occupied, the way a tired child finally settles when a familiar hand is laid, without urgency, upon its shoulder. By the time I reached the last mirror, the tall one by the door, the one the voice on the recording had warned about, the sun had dropped behind the ridge line, and the fog outside had gathered its full, wet weight against every window in the workshop. I named the last one. I called it Aldous. I drew the cloth across in long, unhurried strokes, and the liquid smoke spread across the old glass in slow waves. And the shape behind it, the shape that had been pressing there the longest, the shape closest to the surface, the most patient of all, slowly, slowly laid its palm flat one final time against the inside of the glass, and then it too grew still. The rain keeps on. The ridge country keeps its own long, unhurried time, unbothered by what moves through its hollows and its shadow pockets and the deep places between its old, dark peaks. The fog settles into the gaps for the night, the way it always has, the way it always will, heavy and slow and full of things that do not require a name to be true. The mirrors hold, for now and for as long as the silver holds, they hold. Sleep now. The glass is sealed. The windows are kept.